There is a mountain in northern Arizona that the Hopi say is not empty. From the edge of their mesas, on a clear day, you can look out and see it sitting alone on the far horizon, about 65 miles to the southwest, across the pale open ground of the Painted Desert. On almost every map printed in the last 150 years, it is called the San Francisco Peaks. In the Hopi language, it carries an older name, Nuvatukya Ovi, the place of snow on the very top. And what the Hopi have long said about that mountain is that for half of every year, the beings who bring the rain are shut inside it. I want to be careful with that idea from the very first minute, because it is exactly the kind of thing that gets twisted the moment it leaves the village. So let me show you right away that it is not mine. I did not find it on a forum. I did not dream it up for a thumbnail. It sits in the written record, and we can name the people who put it there. In the year 1905, a man named Henry R. Voth published a book with a plain, heavy title, The Traditions of the Hopi. It was printed by the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago, the institution most people today just call the Field Museum. A couple of years before that, in 1903, a scientist named Jesse Walter Fuchs had published a long illustrated study of the Hopi Katsanam for the Bureau of American Ethnology, the research arm of the Smithsonian in Washington. Those two works, and the two very different men who made them, are the reason we can talk about this with real dates and real pages open in front of us, instead of rumor passed from hand to hand. So that is the whole route of this video. First we go to the mountain. Then we go to the archive. Because there is one line I had to hold on to the entire time I was reading, and I am going to make you hold on to it too. The mountain is real. You could drive to the base of it this afternoon and put your hand on the rock. What the tradition says lives inside it is a completely different kind of statement, and no book, not Voth's and not Fuchs's, can prove that part, and neither of them was ever trying to. This whole video is about carrying both of those things at once. The real peak and the recorded legend. The measurable thing and the reported thing. Keeping them side by side without letting one pretend to be the other, because letting them blur is how you get lied to, in both directions. The debunker blurs it one way. The mystery seller blurs it the other. We are going to try to do neither. So start with the part that is on every map, the part nobody has to take on faith. The San Francisco Peaks are not really separate peaks the way the plural name makes it sound. They are the broken rim of a single old volcano. A long time ago, there was one enormous mountain standing there, a stratovolcano, and over a huge stretch of time, it came apart. And what stands today is the ring of high summits left around where the center used to be. The tallest of them was given the name Humphreys Peak by outsiders, after an army engineer named Andrew Humphreys, who never had anything to do with the Hopi at all. It rises to 12,633 feet. That makes it the single highest point of ground in the entire state of Arizona. From the very top, on a clear day, people say you can see all the way to the far rim of the Grand Canyon. The mountain sits about 10 miles north of the town of Flagstaff, inside the Coconino National Forest, up on the wide, high tableland that geographers call the Colorado Plateau. And here is the thing the name was already telling us. In winter, and long into the spring, the top of that mountain holds snow, well after the desert country below it has gone dry and warm and dusty. The place of snow on the very top. That is not a poetic flourish somebody added later. It is a flat description of what the mountain does, something you could confirm with a photograph taken in February. In a dry land, this is the high, cold place that stays white while everything around it burns off. And in a country that dry, snow on a high peak means much more than scenery. It is water, stored up high and let down slow. It is the promise of springs and green in a land that mostly offers neither one. A people growing corn on a mesa in the high desert had every reason to fix on the one place in sight tall enough to catch the snow and hold it. That mountain was not picked out to be sacred by accident. It was very likely the single most important geographic fact in their entire world. Hold that, because in a minute, it stops being a weather note and becomes the whole point. Now here is the detail that genuinely changed the way I read everything else in the record. The Hopi villages are not at the foot of this mountain. They are not even close. They sit about 65 miles away, across open desert, up on their own mesas. But the peak is so tall, and the air out on that plateau is so clear, that from the Hopi villages you can stand at the edge of your own home and see it. A pale blue shape on the far southwestern horizon, snow on the crown of it, cloud gathering at the summit. So for the people who told these stories, the home of the spirits was never a rumor about some faraway place nobody had been. It was a thing they could see with their own eyes, on any good morning, sitting right there on the edge of the world. Imagine that for a second. Imagine being able to point at the house of your gods from your own doorstep, 65 miles off, and watch the clouds build on its roof. Keep that picture in your head. Almost everything else grows out of it. All right, the archive. Because the honest version of this story goes well past what the Hopi said. It reaches to who was standing there writing it down, and why they were there, and what that act of writing it down actually cost the people it was taken from. Henry R. Voth was not a trained anthropologist, and it matters that he was not. He was a Mennonite missionary, born in 1855, far away in the south of Russia, in a Mennonite community there. He was sent out to the Arizona Territory in 1892 to open a brand new mission field, and in 1893, the Oribe Mennonite Mission was established among the Hopi, with Voth as its first missionary. He came to convert people. That was the entire reason he was there. And he stayed for years, up around the ancient village of Oribe, on the third mesa. And something happened to him in those years that his own church did not entirely know what to do with. He became, almost against the purpose of his own mission, one of the most thorough recorders of Hopi religion who ever lived. Voth learned the language deeply, according to the museum's own note printed in the front of his book, a note signed by the curator George A. Dorsey. Voth collected these traditions in the Hopi tongue, in the people's own words, without an interpreter standing between him and the person speaking. The money that paid for the fieldwork came from a wealthy patron named Stanley McCormick. I am giving you all of these names on purpose, because the names are the receipts. Dorsey the curator, McCormick the patron, Voth the missionary, a real museum in a real city in a fixed year, 1905. This is how a body of sacred knowledge got carried off a mesa in Arizona and locked into a glass case and a printed book in Chicago. And the traditions of the Hopi was only one piece of what Voth set down. The same museum printed his detailed account of the Oribe Pawamu ceremony, and a separate account of the Oribe summer snake ceremony, whole rituals written out step by step. The single book we are leaning on here holds more than 100 separate traditions inside it, and the origin story is only the first one. Whatever you end up thinking about how he got it, the sheer volume of what one difficult man carried off that mesa is honestly staggering, and almost every word of it would otherwise have lived nowhere but in memory, which, as we are about to see, was exactly the thing that was under attack. And now the uncomfortable half, which I will not skip past, because hiding it would make me exactly the kind of narrator I do not trust. Much of Voth's time on the mesa was spent down inside the kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers, watching the ceremonies directly. And the way he got in there was not gentle. He earned, in the plain words of the record, a controversial reputation for forcing his way into Hopi sacred rituals, and for preaching loudly, in Hopi, at people who had not asked him to. His fascination with the culture was completely tangled up with his stated job, which was to dissolve that culture and replace it with his own religion. Both of those drives lived in the same man at the same time. He studied the dances and the prayers and the language with real zeal, and he believed he was there to end them. So when I tell you Voth preserved these words, understand that many Hopi did not experience it as preservation. They experienced it as a man taking things that were never his to take. We are going to come back to that, hard, before the end. Jesse Walter Fuchs came at the whole thing from the opposite direction, as a scientist working for the government. His most important Hopi work is a large illustrated study of the Katsinam, and the single thing that makes it remarkable is that Fuchs did not draw the spirit figures himself. He hired Hopi men to draw them. The main artist was a young man the record writes down by the name White Bear, and it put his age at around 36 years old at the time. His uncle, a man named Homovi, drew some of the very finest of them. A few more came from a man named Winuta. Between them, these Hopi artists produced more than 60 painted plates of the spirit beings, made by Hopi hands. published inside a report with a government seal on the cover. And by some accounts, as word spread through the village that these images were being made for an outsider, the men who drew them came under real suspicion from their own neighbors. Even the act of putting the spirits on paper was not simple. Nothing about this was simple. I keep laying down all of these names for a reason that goes past being thorough. When somebody sells you a spooky version of this story, watch what happens to the names. They vanish. It all dissolves into the elders said, "In the shadows, long ago, nobody knows." But the actual record is the reverse of vague. It has a missionary from Russia, a museum curator, a wealthy patron, 3 named Hopi artists, a specific village on a specific mesa, and 2 exact years. That kind of specificity is the entire difference between history and a campfire tale. It is harder to fake and harder to sell, and it is the only thing worth trusting. Before we climb back up the mountain, we have to get one word exactly right, or everything after it falls apart into nonsense. That word is Katsina. You have very likely seen it spelled Katsina, with a cha in the middle. That spelling is just an outsider's ear doing the best it could with a sound. The Hopi word is Katsina for one of them, and Katsinam for many. So what actually is a Katsina, in the tradition these 2 men recorded? Let me tell you what it is not, first, because the wrong answers are everywhere. It is not an idol. It is not a little carved wooden doll, even though carved figures of them do exist. And you have seen those sold in shops and airports across the Southwest. Those carvings are teaching objects. They are not the thing itself. And a Katsina is not, and I need to say this as flatly as I possibly can, it is not a spaceman. It is not a visitor from another planet. There is nothing, not one line in Voth, not one line in Fuchs, not one line in the actual Hopi telling, that points up at the stars in that way. When you see somebody take these beings and reframe them as ancient astronauts who landed on the peak, understand clearly what has happened. They have left the record completely. They are not reporting Hopi belief anymore. They are just borrowing Hopi faces to decorate a story of their own, and they are counting on you never checking. Here is what the record does say. A Katsina is a spirit. Many of them are understood as ancestors, the dead who have gone on and who return in another form. And above all else, they are tied to clouds and to rain. Fuchs, writing for the Bureau in 1903, described the mechanism of it with real care. He wrote that the Hopi represent their gods in several ways, one of which is by personation, by wearing masks or garments bearing symbols that are regarded as characteristic of those beings. Read that again slowly, because it is doing a lot of quiet work. The masked dancer out in the plaza is not putting on a costume to entertain a crowd. In the ceremony, he is a personation. He is the way the spirit is made present among the people. That is a subtle and serious religious idea, and it is a very long way from a puppet, and an even longer way from a flying saucer. And there is not just one of them. The painted plates that those Hopi artists made for Fuchs record dozens of separate Katsinam, each one its own being, with its own markings, its own name, its own job in the world. What he documented was not a single spirit at all. It was closer to a whole population of them, a crowded and highly specific spirit world, sorted and remembered in detail. That is not the shape of vague superstition. It is the shape of a long, inherited system that people had maintained carefully across many generations. So when the Hopi say the Katsinam live in the mountain, they are not describing little figures who parked a craft on Humphreys Peak. They are saying that the spirits of the rain, who are in some deep sense the ancestors themselves, keep their home on the one high place in all that country that holds snow into the summer and grows the clouds that feed the corn. And once you actually hear it that way, it stops sounding like a code to be cracked, and it starts sounding like something much more impressive. It sounds like people paying extraordinarily close attention to the exact sky they depended on to survive, and building a whole sacred world out of what they saw. Now put the mountain and the meaning back together. To the Hopi, Nuvatukya Ovi is the home of the Katsinam, the one place they belong to, and the place they return to. The careful accounts of Hopi belief describe the spirits as living among the clouds around the summit for half of the year. The peak stands off to the southwest of the villages, and in the Hopi ordering of the whole world, It anchors that entire southwestern direction. There are shrines up on it. It is one of a small handful of mountains that mark out the edges of the Hopi world in the four directions, and it is held sacred not only by the Hopi but, by one careful modern count, by 13 different tribes of that region. This is not a private little belief held by a few families. It is one of the great sacred mountains of the American Southwest, and it has been for a very long time. And this is exactly the place where I have to stop and mark the seam out loud, the way I promised you at the start. Everything I just told you about the mountain being 12,000 feet of eroded volcano, 10 miles from Flagstaff, snow on the top into summer, that is all measurable. You can check every word of it. What I am about to keep telling you, that spirits of the rain keep their home among the clouds on that summit, is not that kind of fact at all. It is what the tradition holds. Voth and Fuchs can prove to you that the Hopi said it, and roughly how they said it, and exactly when they wrote it down. They cannot prove to you that it is true, and they knew that perfectly well, and they were not trying to prove it. The honest word for this part of the story is not proven, and it is not debunked. The honest word is reported. This is faithfully what the people said. What you choose to do with it after that is entirely yours to decide, and I mean that. So we finally arrive at the word in the title. Sealed. What does it actually mean to say that something is sealed beneath, or sealed within, this mountain? I went looking for the vault. I want to be honest about that with you, because the vault is the version that gets the clicks, and I felt the pull of it too. Is there a Hopi story of a hidden chamber, a lost city, a locked stone door in the side of the peak with relics stacked behind it? And the answer, in the real Hopi record, is no. That version does not come from the Hopi at all. Where a story like that has ever been pinned to this general stretch of Arizona, it traces back to a newspaper stunt from the early 1900s. A thing the Hopi never told and never claimed, and were never even really consulted about. And I am leaving that stunt exactly where it belongs, which is out of this video. Nothing in Voth, and nothing in Fuchs, describes a treasure room under the peak. That is simply not what is in there. What is sealed inside the mountain, in the tradition as these men recorded it, is not gold, and it is not a building. It is the spirits themselves. For 6 months out of every 12, the Katsanam are understood to be withdrawn into that mountain, present but unseen, held within the snow and the cloud at the summit. That is the seal, a season of absence. The rain-bringers go home, and the high place closes around them, and the people down on the mesas simply wait. When you hear it in that register, the word sealed stops being about hiding something valuable from thieves, and it starts being about a promise being kept somewhere you are not allowed to watch. The corn standing in the fields, 65 miles from the mountain, is depending on a covenant that is, for now, shut up inside a peak on the horizon. I sat with that for a long time, honestly, because it is so much stranger and so much better than a vault ever could have been. A vault is a dead thing. You either find it or you do not, and once it is opened, the story is over. This is a living arrangement with a mountain, renewed every single year on a fixed schedule. And that schedule turns out to be the next piece of it, and it is the part where the tradition gets almost unbearably specific and concrete. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because the seal is not shut forever. It opens. And the Hopi could tell you, almost to the day, when it opens. The hinge of the whole year is the winter solstice, the shortest day, in the depth of December. The great Hopi ceremony around that moment is called Soyel, and what happens at Soyel, in the practice that was recorded, is that the Katsina season begins. The kivas, those underground chambers dug down into the rock of the mesa, are ritually opened. A chief Katsina comes in, and from that point, all through the hardest cold of the winter, and on into the following summer, the spirits are understood to be down among the people, walking in the villages, not away in the mountain. They come, in the tradition, to help turn the sun back toward the world after the longest night, and, when they are honored properly with the right songs and the right ceremony, to carry the promise of the rain that the corn will need. And notice what that does to the other word in the title. Beneath, the most literal underground space in this entire story is not a myth at all. It is the kiva. It is a real room, dug into real rock, that a real person climbs down into on a wooden ladder. Remember what the record told us about Voth, that he spent much of his time down inside those very kivas, watching. When the tradition speaks about the sacred rising up from below, there is an actual architecture sitting underneath the idea, a physical downstairs to the religion. That is the exact kind of detail I have learned to trust, because it is doing two jobs at once without any strain. It is a physical fact you could photograph, and it is a piece of the cosmology, in the same breath, and neither one is pretending to be the other. Then, at the far end of the season, in the very heart of summer, in July, comes the ceremony that closes the whole thing back up. It is called the Nyman, and it is usually translated as the home dance. And the name is not decoration. It tells you precisely what it is. It is the going home. At the Nyman, the Katsinim are formally sent back to the southwest, back across all that open desert, back to Nuvatukyaovi. The long season among the living comes to its end. The spirits withdraw to the peak, and the mountain seals shut around them once more, and it stays shut until the next winter solstice calls them down again. Half the year visible, among the people, in the plazas, half the year sealed away in the snow of the mountain. That is the clock the entire thing runs on. And that clock was turning for a very long time before either Voth or Fuchs ever climbed a mesa with a notebook. And here, one more time, the measurable world and the reported one sit right on top of each other, and I have come to think that overlap is the whole reason the belief took the exact shape it did. Because in the real summers out on that plateau, the clouds genuinely do build up over the high peak first, in the heat of the day, before the monsoon storms sweep out across the lower desert toward the mesas. A farming people, watching the sky for the water that would decide whether they ate that year, would have seen the rain being born on that mountain, summer after summer, for centuries. You do not have to believe in a single spirit to understand why that one peak, and not some other hill, became the home of the rain. The mountain really is, in plain physical fact, where the clouds come from. What the tradition does is take that plain fact and give it a home, and a face, and a name. And that clock is running on top of something older still, which is the real reason the whole idea of below runs through this tradition like a root system. Because the Hopi do not begin their story on this world, they begin it underneath this world. When you open Voth's book to the very first tradition, the origin story, it begins in a way I honestly did not expect from a stiff museum publication from 1905. The first line is almost quiet. A very long time ago, it says, there was nothing but water. In the east, a deity of all hard substances, called in the text Huruing Wuchti, lived in the ocean. From that still beginning, the tradition builds up the world, and it builds up the people, and the central motion of the entire Hopi origin story is emergence. Coming up. In these accounts, the people lived in earlier worlds down below this one, and they climbed up, out of the world beneath, into the present world through an opening from underneath. And Voth writes down one line about the Katsinam that ties the whole structure together across time. In the emergence, he records that among the very first people there were the Hopi Katsinam, which the Hopi brought with them from the underworld. Sit with that for just a second. The rain spirits are not some late addition. In the tradition, they came up out of the world below, alongside the first human beings, at the absolute start of everything. So when those same spirits spend 6 months of every year sealed back inside a mountain, the shape of it rhymes exactly with the oldest layer of the entire belief. From below, and then up, sealed, and then released. The mountain in the present is quietly running the very same pattern that the origin story set down at the beginning of time. That is not a coincidence a museum invented. That is a religion that is deeply consistent with itself, all the way down. I am not going to pretend for 1 second that I can prove any of the cosmology, and you already know that, because we marked the seam and we are keeping to it. But I will tell you this much, as somebody who actually went and read the real pages instead of a summary of a summary. It holds together. It is not a random pile of spooky images thrown at a wall. It is a worked-out, internally consistent account of a world that comes up from below and then depends, for its survival, on what a specific mountain agrees to give back. That is not the product of confusion or of primitive fear, whatever the men with the notebooks may privately have thought. That is the product of an enormous span of time spent watching the sky and thinking hard about it. Which brings me to the hardest part of all of this, and honestly the part I think matters the most. Because there is a reason I have kept hammering on the names and the dates, and it is not that I am fussy. It is that these words came within a hair of being lost entirely, and the exact years when they were finally written down were some of the worst years the Hopi had ever lived through. Look again at those two dates. Fuchs 1903, Voth 1905. Now set them right next to what was actually happening on the third mesa, in that precise window of time. In 1906, the old village of Oraibi, which may well be the oldest continuously lived-in settlement in all of North America, a place people had held without a break, since somewhere around the year 1100, tore itself completely in two. The fight was about the outside world forcing its way in, and specifically about the American government's schools, and whether Hopi children would be handed over to them. One faction, remembered as the Friendlies, led by a man named Tawaquaptiwa, was willing to let the schooling happen. The other faction, called the Hostiles, led by a man named Ukiuma, refused, and wanted to keep the old ceremonial life sealed off from every bit of it. And the way the two sides finally settled it is almost impossible to believe, because it was not a battle, and nobody was killed. They drew a long line on the ground, and the two groups pushed against each other across it, a literal pushing contest. A test of strength over a scratched line in the earth, with an agreement in advance that whichever side was forced back would leave the village for good. Ukiuma and his people were pushed back over the line, and they kept their word. They left. They walked off and founded a brand new village called Hotevila, a few miles away, and that was the end of Oraibi as one whole unbroken community, after nearly 1,000 years of standing as one. And the record does not stop at the split, and it gets darker after it. In the aftermath, government forces took men from the resisting group away toward the agency at Keams Canyon and held them there at hard labor. This is the same tiny handful of years as the books. The pages are coming off the press in Chicago, being bound and shelved and sold, while the living village that carried the tradition is being pulled apart by the exact pressure those books do not say a single word about. So who, in the end, is the villain of this story? It is not a person. It is not a shadowy agency hiding a body in a warehouse. There is no secret being kept from you by men in suits. The villain is that pressure itself. It is the schools that were designed, on purpose, to make certain that the next generation of Hopi children could no longer speak the words or sing the songs. It is the removal and the hard labor and the slow, grinding, patient wait of a much larger nation, deciding that an entire people's inner world was a problem, to be corrected and cleared away. Against a force like that, a book is a painfully fragile thing. It turns out that a book, even a book made for the wrong reasons by a difficult man, can also work as a lifeboat. And I cannot let Voth walk out of here clean, because that would be its own kind of lie, and this whole video has been about not lying in either direction. Remember exactly what he was. He was a missionary. His actual assigned job, the entire reason his church sent him across an ocean and a continent, was to replace the very religion he was so carefully writing down in the evenings. A great many Hopi did not want their most sacred ceremonies watched, and recorded, and photographed, least of all by a man who had forced his way into the kiva, and who was there, by his own account, to end the whole thing. In the years that followed, his work was remembered by many Hopi people as a genuine violation, a theft of things that were never offered and never his. And both of these facts are completely true at the same moment, and I am going to refuse to resolve that neatly for you. The same relentless thoroughness that preserved these words for us was experienced by the people it was taken from as a wound while it was happening. The archive that saved the tradition was also, at the very same time, a part of the pressure crushing down on it. If you came here wanting a clean hero to admire, this story does not contain one, and I have come to think that being honest about that is the only way to tell it with any respect at all. There is one last piece of honesty I owe you before we go back to the mountain. When the tradition itself is telling its own origin, it does not hand us the name of a single elder as the author. Voth recorded these as the traditions of a whole people, not as the private memoir of one man on one afternoon. And in the places where the record simply does not name a person, I am not going to invent one for you, just to make the story feel more intimate. Nobody signed the origin story. No single elder holds the copyright on the emergence. It came down through far more mouths than anyone ever counted, across far more years than anyone ever wrote, and it finally reached a printing press in Chicago in 1905, carried there by a Mennonite missionary who barely belonged to it and did not entirely believe it. That is the actual chain of custody. It is so much messier than a clean legend, and, to me at least, it is far more moving for being messy. And it is worth saying, clearly, that the Hopi are still here. The ceremonies are still held. This is not a dead religion sitting in a museum case, and the Katsanam are not a folk memory. The season still turns on the mesas today. But here is where it comes full circle, in a way I did not expect. In the years since Voth, a great many of these ceremonies have been closed to outsiders completely. No cameras, no visitors, no notebooks. In a real sense, the door that Voth forced his way through has since been shut again, on purpose, by the people whose door it always was. Which means the old books are now a record of a moment that will most likely never open to an outsider the same way again. The archive is a photograph of an opening that has since closed. So what is really sealed beneath the San Francisco peaks? Not a city, not a vault, not a ship, and not a chest of gold. What the Hopi said, and what two very different outsiders were careful enough, or intrusive enough, to write down before it could be silenced, is this. A mountain standing alone on the far horizon is the home of the rain, and for half of every year, the spirits who carry that rain are shut inside the snow at its summit, present but unseen, waiting for the winter solstice to open the kivas and call them back down to the fields of the people. The peak is still standing, right where it always was. You can still see it from the mesas on a clear morning, a pale shape on the southwest horizon, exactly the way they saw it. The solstice still comes around every December without fail. The home dance still sends the spirits back home in July. The clock the whole tradition runs on has not stopped, whatever a museum in Chicago once printed and shelved about it. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. And the next time you see a mountain standing alone on a horizon somewhere, with snow held on the very top of it and cloud gathering around the summit, I hope you remember that somebody once looked at that exact same shape and did not see empty rock. They saw a home, sealed for the season, and they were keeping a promise with it that they fully intended to keep forever.